Welcome to the DL channel. Thank you again for joining us as we fly through African American history with the Tuskegee Airmen. Today we have the honor and privilege of speaking with Lieutenant Colonel Terrence Spann. Thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you for having me.
Great. We also have live with us today, we connected a couple of schools. We have Double Springs Middle School in Alabama, so welcome Double Springs. We have Gloucester Public School System out in New Jersey. Welcome, Gloucester. All right, we have Meek Elementary School in Alabama. Welcome, Meek Elementary. And we have Mendenhall Middle School in North Carolina. Welcome, Mendenhall. Hey. And we have Natchitoches Magnet in Louisiana, so welcome, Natchitoches. All right. I also want to welcome the audience that are tuning in to the DLN channel and watching virtually, and invite you to send in questions to the DLN channel at gmail.com, and we'll get your questions answered during the live broadcast. All right. Okay. So, Lieutenant Colonel Terrence Spann, you're the president of Tidewater Chapter Tuskegee Airmen Incorporated.
Yes.
All right.
TJ.
Okay. So we're gonna TJ. All right. And you're engaged with many Tuskegee Airmen that tell their stories of their involvement during World War II.
Yes.
Okay. So how would you define the Tuskegee Airmen?
Well, Karen, I would define the Tuskegee Airmen as a group of men who fought for the right to fight for their own country. These men were participated in the Tuskegee Airmen experiment, or an experiment that was pretty much designed, if not expected to fail. Fortunately, these men, totaling about 19,000, did not fail. Thank goodness they did not.
Okay. Now, there's a lot of talk about a General Davis.
Yes.
Who was General Davis, and what made him so significant to Tuskegee?
General Davis is a very special person. He's passed now, but General Davis was a cadet, was like the 5th cadet that went to of African American descent that attended West Point. The discipline that he had to endure during the time he was at West Point was incredible. Case in point, as one example, General, then he was Cadet Davis. Cadet Davis could participate in all the activities that the other cadets participated in as far as schoolwork was concerned. He could eat with them during the week, Monday through Friday. However, when it came to the weekends, and there were over 200 cadets there was in his class, he had to go to a table, each table, to ask if he could be seated amongst his peers. 200 times, over 200 times, he was refused, and he wound up eating his meal by himself. He endured this for 4 years. Can you imagine being told after 200 times for 4 years that you can't be seated with me even though I'm your classmate? Well, he graduated, I think it was either 27th or 35th. He graduated 35th amongst all his class members. It was quite a feat for a young man who had to really endure a lot during early in his life. He wasn't even 21 years old yet. So it took that kind of person and that kind of personality and character to really come into the Tuskegee Airmen experiment mode and be a commander, a real commanding commander of these group of men who had no clue as to what the military was about, that he had to train.
Okay, and this probably explains why he received so much respect from those followers of his.
Yes.
Because they understood that he did lead them from his own personal experience.
Right. He was a leader among men.
Mm-hmm. Okay, now you pride yourself in helping to extend the heritage and legacy of the Tuskegee Airmen, and you should. How did you become involved with the Tuskegee Airmen?
Well, it's a long story, but I'll make it short.
Okay.
when I went to historically black college and university in Tennessee State University in Nashville, Tennessee, I went to the Air Force Reserve Officer Training Corps program, and that's where I first learned about the Tuskegee Airmen. Unlike the students here, they're learning it in elementary and middle school and high school. It wasn't until college before I ever heard about the Tuskegee Airmen. This is something that occurred back in the 1940s. And once I heard about them and understood their story, and I began to, all of us as students began to realize, had they failed, I mean, really, it resonates with me even now, had they failed, there was no way that I would have been able to come into the military as an officer at all, maybe enlisted at the most, and then maybe only as a cook or supply hand or some subservient role. But I never would have been able to be a leader of men of all cultural groups at all.
Okay, so that was predominantly the role of African Americans in the military at that time were roles of cooks, of
Janitors,
custodial staff, yes, that
correct.
sort of thing. So no one served in a predominant role
Right.
in the military until the way was paved.
And you definitely didn't supervise anybody of another culture other than your own. They did not.
Okay, okay. All right, now, as you hear various stories from Tuskegee Airmen who served in different positions during World War II, what images of segregation do they describe?
They describe segregation as being one of the worst things that you could ever encounter. For example, one of my original Tuskegee Airmen explained that when he was on not so much vacation but leave, or weekend leave, he went into the city of Atlanta, and while there, he had encountered a couple other officers who were in uniform like him. He saluted them, and they were white officers. He saluted them, and then they cursed him. One of the two, who he said was drinking, they cursed while in uniform, and then threatened to even do more harm to. Well, that individual, that particular original Tuskegee Airman, decided he had to get it back to base, which was Tuskegee Tuskegee Army Airfield at the time. And another example is one of our officers. That gentleman was enlisted. One of our officers, Lieutenant Colonel Horn, he was a radio operator while he was enlisted, but he got out because he was so frustrated with what happened. He went in to take, as an enlisted person, he wanted to fly, and he wanted to take the exam for a pilot certification. He was told to wait out in the hallway with another colored gentleman. So the two of them were outside in the hallway as the other cadets or the other pilot trainees were taking their tests in the classroom. When they were finished, the instructor came out that administered the test and told them, "Hey, what are you guys still doing here?" And he's like, "Well, we're waiting to take the test." And he told them that you missed it. You missed your opportunity. Go home, boy. You can't take the test. So that bitterness that Colonel Horn endured then stayed with him for decades. It was only until we got him a F-15 flight. F-15s, is nowadays, about 12, 13 years ago, that he said he finally has seen the promised land. He's finally felt like he had endured, all that he had endured had finally been lifted off of him because he finally got a chance to fly, which is all that he wanted to do.
Yeah, and I've noticed similar patterns and stories from Tuskegee Airmen that the segregation, the unequal rights that they received did not just end then. Right. When the war ended, a lot of that stuff get trickled on, and it kept going, and it did create like some bitter feelings, some harshness, yes. And so that made them have to persevere even more.
It did.
To serve in our military despite those types of conditions. Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. Here's another question I want to ask you, and this is going to get a little involved. African Americans played a pivotal role in securing their status in the military. It began with Booker T. Washington, who opened a rundown building with 30 African American students, not young students, but older students training to be teachers. Washington believed in training the trainer. teaching many other African Americans like George Washington Carver. On July 4th, 1881, a legend was born. Believing everything could be taught at Tuskegee, he paved the way, again, for George Washington Carver and others alike. You may not have attended Tuskegee Institute, but how have these events paved the way for you?
Well, what it taught me, I alluded to it earlier when I said I attended Tennessee State University, which is another HBCU, just like Tuskegee is. There was a sense of pride that we saw as we studied Booker T. Washington and Carver and W. Du Bois and the rest. There was a sense of pride that they had as colored black men and women, and they made sure that while attending those universities, that they did the best they could. They always put their best foot forward. There was failure was not an option in their eyes, and that was something that they perpetuated in the kids that attended those Tuskegee University or Tuskegee Institute at the time, as well as a number of other schools that a number of men and women of African descent attended.
Okay, yeah. So, what Booker T. Washington saw was that, you could not attend a university, a traditional university. So, establishing a university that would cater to African Americans at that time would be ideal.
That's correct.
Okay, so
Yes.
creating an institute like Tuskegee, in which it would train, all types of training. A lot of our records today kind of emphasize that it was a pilot training program, but they really taught just about everything.
They taught all the disciplines.
At
It was primarily an agricultural and industrial university or school, because those are the trades that only colored folk could do or aspire to do at that time. So they focused on agriculture and industrial careers, but you can't include the aviation program as part of an agricultural and industrial program. That was exceeding the standard, so to speak, and that's something that the leadership back then, kudos to them for looking beyond just the A and the I, and looking forward and seizing some opportunities that World War I, at the end of World War I, and that World War II brought on.
Okay. All right, so in addition to the famed All-American pilot program at Tuskegee Institute, Willa Brown,
Yes.
all right, and a lot of students may not know who Willa Brown is, but Willa Brown, she was a high school teacher in Indiana, an African-American high school teacher, and she learned to fly. She took flight lessons because she felt her calling was greater than a high school teacher, so she learned to fly. And then she married her flight instructor, Cornelius Coffey, and then they established the Coffey School of Aeronautics in Harlem, at the Harlem Airport in Chicago. And then they started to train black pilots and aviation mechanics, and these individuals went on to create collaborative groups, and they partnered with Tuskegee Institute, the program that trained pilots down there, and created a lot of prestigious squadrons that we hear about, like the 332nd. So what can you say about this type of collaboration and teamwork and the successes it gave to Tuskegee?
I would have to say that it's pivotal. It was extremely critical that those collaborations occurred at that time. It amazed me when I first became a part of this organization as to learn as to how many certified pilots were already flying crop dusters and other aircraft before they even came into the Tuskegee Airmen experiment, before they went to Moulton Field. Moulton Field is where the primary aircraft training or flight training occurred. Primary meaning ground training. They did instrument. They learned how to do flight plans. They learned how to do weather. That's where the math really was critical and had to be demonstrated, was at that level. Because and then when they finally got off the ground and start flying them, they would let them fly level and maybe do a couple banks here and there, and then let them try to use the instruments to just land, as opposed to doing visual flight rule kinds of flying. And then at Tuskegee Army Airfield, that was where the advanced flight training occurred once they were a platform or an aircraft was selected for them to fly.
Okay. Okay.
So it was critical.
Okay, good. So kids need to know that, working together, teamwork, it wasn't just one group, it wasn't just one person.
Right.
It took the initiatives of a bunch of different people coming together to create some of the successes that came out of it.
If I could add,
Yeah.
Talking about collaborations, had it not been for the National Urban League, the NAACP, the Urban League, the Porters and Waiters, the Pittsburgh Courier, those civilian groups or organizations working in hand with the military, these Tuskegee Airmen who were active duty and in the military, had it not been for those two coming together, communicating effectively with one another, again, the Tuskegee experiment would have failed. So collaborations like that, as well as those that were involved in just the flying portion of the program, was fun. It was critical. It was phenomenal, and even the guys, a lot of students may think that the Tuskegee Airmen are only pilots and navigators, and which is so untrue. For every one pilot, there's usually 10 individuals on the ground, be they supply or aircraft maintainers, accountants, contracting personnel, all kinds of administrators, all types of individuals and career fields that comprised the Tuskegee Airmen experiment and those airmen that were involved in the experiment. So it was a number of career fields and collaborations that were required in order to fulfill the missions or meet the missions and the obligations.
Okay. All right, I want to break in because I have some more questions, but I do want to give our students an opportunity to ask some questions out there. So I want to begin with Double Springs Middle Schools. If you would unmute your mic if you'd like to ask a question to Colonel T.J. Spann.
Why do you wear the red jacket?
Real
loud for me.
I wear the red jacket because it's symbolic of the Red Tails. You've heard of the Red Tails movie, right? Well, it's symbolic of the red tail that was on the P-51 Mustang, which we have a model of right here. That red tail was a color that was decided by the men when they were over in Italy fighting. They decided that they wanted, when they were asked or requested to fly the escort missions for the bombers, they wanted to make sure that they were distinguished from the other pilots or non-colored, non-black pilots. So they gave their tail and the prop a distinct color, so loud and so burning red that you couldn't miss it. Okay, so this red jacket is worn or represents exactly that, the red tail of the aircraft. A very good question.
All right, and we'll take another question from Double Springs Middle Schools before we move to another school.
How many planes did y'all have while in training?
Okay, how many planes did they have while they were in training?
While in training, I'm not sure how many planes that were actually used while in training. One of the training aircrafts was an AT-6 that the Tuskegee Airmen and a number of other pilots used. But that, as you'll see on your monitor, that particular aircraft was one that they used a lot. And you can see how old it is. So it's not something that's current day by any stretch. But suffice it to say that there were 996 pilots that were trained in the Tuskegee Airmen organization or during the experiment. Only about 400 of those were combat or fighter pilots. The remainder were part of the bombing group. Another great question.
Good question. Okay, we want to give Gloucester an opportunity to ask questions. So, Gloucester, if you have any questions.
Yeah, sure. Robert, speak up. What did you eat back then in the war?
What type of food back in the war?
Well, I may look like I'm 80 or 90 some years old, but I'm really not. I'm only about 50. Uh, so I really don't know what the food was that they ate. However, you can bet it was, given that there were a lot of chickens and cows and things like that, that they did partake of some good solid food. From what I was told, they didn't have the meals ready to eat like we do today in today's military. They actually had real good food, probably good home cooked food compared to what we have nowadays. So that's all that I know. I wished I had thought to ask them of, if there was green beans or macaroni and cheese or some of that in their diet.
Oh,
But no, I don't know. That's all that I do know.
Well, one thing that happened during the war was there was a lot of rations because of the expenditures, how much it cost for war, that the U.S. had to redirect their monies in support of the war. So not only were the military affected by these rations, the civilian community, all of us, or not us in particular, but us as civilians, were affected. So there were rations on like luxury items like sugar. So you didn't necessarily have your drink sweetened the way you usually like it because you're allotted to buy so much sugar for that month. So you had these different rations, and they even had coupons or something that you had to send in to ensure that you adhered or maintained your particular ration for your family for that month. So that way most of the funding, the sources went toward the war. So yeah, so a lot of people did a lot of sacrificing, and it did change the way the diet, the way we ate, because it wasn't just eating at leisure, because you were affected by how much you could actually gather or get from your markets, or if you had so many chickens you had on your farm, you might have to allocate so many of that toward the war. So yeah, good question. Okay, one more question from Gloucester.
How did you feel about the war?
How do you feel about the war? How did you feel? How do you?
Well, hello. I wasn't there. However, World War II was necessary. Hitler was trying to dominate the world, and it was necessary for the nations to come to, not only the United States, but the other nations that were over in Europe, to come together to undo or stop him from being as aggressive as he was during World War II. For him to have, if he had succeeded, then what we know today as being the United States would not be at all. A number of you we would definitely be segregated from other cultural groups. So it would not have been a nice scenario, I think, for us today.
Okay, so there was a lot of prejudice that spearheaded this segregation in Europe as well, and the aggressions of Adolf Hitler, and you may be reading about this in your history books. Hopefully, you will, if you haven't already. Had to be stopped. So it was over 60 countries, just like Colonel Spann said. It was over 60 countries that came together to stop this what we call war on fascism, which is a greater scale of racism. So you had this dictator that demanded an end, if you will, to particular races, and only because of his personal beliefs and nothing factual, but his personal digressions toward it. So yeah, we had to end that because ideologies like that can spearhead and cause destruction in a whole lot of different other countries too. So stopping it there helped to pave the way for more equality in America as well. So good question. All right, we want to give Meek Elementary opportunity to ask questions. So Meek Elementary.
What was your job? Were you a pilot or were you something else?
Okay, what was your job?
I guess in your question, I would qualify as being something else. I was not a pilot. I wanted to be a pilot, but I was told that back in 1981, way before you were born, that my vision wasn't good enough to qualify. I had to, and they weren't giving waivers at the time. So I was smart enough to be a pilot, but I wasn't. Unfortunately, my sight wasn't good enough to qualify. What I did do was when I came into the military, into the Air Force, they wanted me to be a supply officer. Nowadays it's called as well as a logistics officer. But as a supply officer, I was responsible for ensuring that the aircraft maintenance units had all the parts that they needed to repair or make sure that the planes continued to fly. If it had not been, if I had failed in my job, then that meant that there would have been a number of aircraft that were down on the ground and unable to fly their full mission, at a full mission capable status, unless I did my job effectively. So that's what my job was to make sure that for flight line purposes that I got aircraft parts to the maintainers who maintain the aircraft so the pilots could fly. So it was a direct support of the flying mission.
Okay, and that's a good question because it's good to know that, like you said earlier, you touched on it, that for every pilot there was about 10 people in support of that. So you had engineers and technicians, and in order to support that pilot to be able to fulfill his or his mission at the time, it's her or his mission now. But in order to fulfill his mission, he had to have support.
Right.
All right, so that's good to know. Okay, and then another question from Meek Elementary.
How many bombers did y'all escort?
How many bombers were escorted?
Wow. It was hundreds of bombers that were being escorted. They had, again, we're talking about Germany and Adolf Hitler, and the bombers that were used or employed at that time were B-17s, B-24s, and B-25s, depending on the year that we're talking about. And those bombers, and the reason why I say there are hundreds is because it took hundreds to, because you have to account for losing some bombers. The ones that the Red Tails escorted, there weren't, we didn't lose as many. We did lose some, but most of the ones that were lost during our combat or during our escorts were lost due to ground fire. So artillery or infantry, those units on the ground that shot those bullets or up in the air, those are the ones that were bringing down the aircraft, the bombers, more so than other fighter planes that the German flew to bring those planes down. I wanted to, this being the math part of STEM, I wanted to just mention to you that before the Tuskegee Airmen, the pilots were requested. The United States was losing, the War Department was losing about 25 bombers a day. And each one of those aircraft had at least 10 individuals in them. So if you do the math, 25 times 10, you can see how many men were being lost, 250 a day being lost because of the escorts at that time. They were not sticking with the bombers to fly their missions. So after you've done 250 a day and after a week, you've got well over or close to 25 or over 20,000 that are lost. Can you imagine not having a grandparent because of those losses? So the Tuskegee Airmen really did help to minimize and reduce those losses of those individuals who were flying the bombers, and they were not black pilots flying those bombers at that time because there were some issues back in the United States that kept them from actually flying in World War II. But they did fly in subsequent wars like Korean War, Vietnam, etc.
Okay, so there was some science behind what we call the P-51s
Yes.
that escorted the bombers, and you were talking about the math in calculating. The P-51s were enabled to go further and escort the bombers at
Yes.
that time, and when they were able to go further in the escort, they were able to provide more protection, and hence successfully get the bombers to their destination to drop the bombs and escort them back. So
Right.
that helped to preserve a lot of those lives that you were saying. You know, you got about 10 people, you know, at minimum on each one of those bombing planes.
That's right.
And being escorted back, you know, there was a lot of lives that were preserved
A
there.
lot of lives that were saved, a lot.
Yes. Okay, we want to give Mendenhall Middle School an opportunity for some questions.
We would like to just first of all thank you for your service in just the military. And Rachel, I think you had a question.
What makes you the most proud to represent the Tuskegee Airmen?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
What makes you the most proud to represent the Tuskegee Airmen?
Okay. Well, first of all, let me say thank you for acknowledging my service. I appreciate that, and I'm very proud of it. I did 21 and a half years in the Air Force. What makes me most proud about the Tuskegee Airmen is the fact that they recognized that they could not fail. Had they failed, there were numerous generations of colored, Negro, black African Americans that would not have been able to aspire to what I was able to achieve in the military. They had to suffer and endure a lot. There was a lot of, you know, just think if somebody told you, young lady, that because you're a young lady, that you could not take a test or you could not do a certain job. Now, as qualified and smart as you are, you know, that would really hurt your feelings, wouldn't it? So those are the kinds of things that they had to endure that I think made us proud, but also gave me an opportunity to truly appreciate what I do, and it changed the lifestyles of my family for sure.
Mm-hmm. Good question. All right, do you have any other questions for Mendenhall?
Is there an airman story that you're particularly fond of?
Wow.
Got to think about that.
Yes, I shared the one about the airman who was not able to take the test. There's another one. This gentleman, he told me that he didn't endure as much discrimination as three of the other original Tuskegee Airmen in our chapter, but he told me that he shared with me that when he was stationed out in California, that he was a flight engineer, and as a flight engineer, he was unable to go on certain missions because there were no facilities for colored people at that time. For instance, there used to be, it was the ferry command that he was referring to, and they used to fly the B-17s over to Hawaii, and then from Hawaii back. Well, when they flew over there, they asked repeatedly if they could fly those missions because they were flight engineers. They were just as capable as the white flight engineers, and they told them no. And the reason why they told them no was because there were no facilities for colored people in Hawaii that could accommodate them. And they said that they were on the plane. They wanted to go. And part of the reason why they wanted to go was because it was they made $27 a month. That was an additional $27, so a total of $54 that they would be able to get for that month if they flew those kinds of missions. But because they were unable to, they just had to be flight engineers that made $27 a month.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and I want to give Nakadish Magni an opportunity to ask questions. So, Nakadish?
Neat.
Okay, any questions from Nakadish? Okay, well, if you do, just chime in. But meanwhile, I want to go back into a story. A young lady asked about a story, and I have one, and I want to ask you something about this. There are many stories from documented original Tuskegee Airmen, that's what we call them, DOTAs or DOTAs, and many describe segregation in the military. One story in particular pertaining to 100 officers standing up against a segregated officer club at Freeman Field in Indiana led Roger Terry, who was a second lieutenant Tuskegee pilot, to be convicted, stripped of his rank, and dishonorably discharged during the Freeman Field mutiny. Now, then he fought for equal rights, but he also fought for equal promotions. Through your experiences with Tuskegee Airmen, do many of the original Tuskegee Airmen talk freely about the restraints that they endured during their services?
Freely being the operative word, no.
Okay.
They don't. A number of them were ashamed until about 1976. A number of them would not even talk about it. One of the original Tuskegee Airmen that was here a couple weeks ago, Corporal Gore, I've spoken to his kids and grandkids, and they said that he never said a word about it until about 5 years ago, and he joined us the year after. And the reason why, again, is because he was just ashamed. He didn't think anybody cared or wanted to know about it. He didn't think they did anything that was substantial, and the way the Americans treated them, or treated the Air Force treated, the Army Air Corps treated the whole event or experiment is as if it didn't matter. So yes, there is some hesitation for them to want to participate or to freely comment about what they encountered. But for Mr. Terry in particular, what we're talking about is the Freeman Field mutiny. And the Freeman Field mutiny was in Indiana, and the individuals that you mentioned, the 100, and it was actually 101. Initially, there were only 61 of them that tried to get into the officers' club. The officers' club was supposed to be for all officers, but the commander at that time was Colonel Selway, and Colonel Selway changed the regulations or changed the instructions to say that it would only pertain to those who were not in a training status. So it's for instructors. So none of the black pilots were instructors. They were all considered to be quote-unquote trainees, even though some of them had flown missions over in Italy. Unfortunately, when they tried to get into the officers' club, 61 of them initially were immediately arrested, and Lieutenant Terry was one of them that actually bumped against the provost officer. And when I say bump, I mean he did not knock the guy out. He just kind of brushed him on the way into the club. And you see a picture of him there. You know, that's what he told us. He unfortunately, he died last year. But he said that he didn't do anything more than that. He was dishonorably discharged. Of the 101, there were 40 more gentlemen who stepped up and said they were going to go into the club too. So those 101 gentlemen decided, they were arrested. They were the only one who was a lawyer was Lieutenant Terry. So because he had a felony, he could not, once he got discharged dishonorably, he could not practice his being a lawyer, which is what he had gone into the military with, that degree. So it devastated him and his livelihood for decades because he could not practice what he had gone to school to learn. So he was still successful despite the fact that he was dishonorably discharged. But it took a recent president to dismiss and it was President Barack Obama, to dismiss what happened before he could get all his rights back, before he could even vote. So for almost 60 years, he could not vote because he had been dishonorably discharged. So that was devastating for an individual like that to be able to encounter. As bright and smart as he was to be a lawyer, to not be able to come out and practice what he had gone to school to learn, and to be denied his rights to even vote. So it was a lesson learned for us all, that when you get the opportunity to go to school and learn, don't blow it.
That's all the time we have for today. Thank you for tuning in to the DL Info channel as we fly through African American history with the Tuskegee Airmen. Thank you again for all of your comments and great questions. You have a good day. Goodbye.